Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Katie Ensweiler. I'm the marketing manager at VonLehman CPA and advisory firm. Huge thank you to Fraternal Law for partnering with us on this event. We're looking forward to a great session. Before we get started, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat feature. I will pop back on camera and ask our speaker those questions, or we might have time for them as well at the end. We are recording the session, so we will be sending out a link to that later on today or tomorrow morning. Also, we are offering CPE for this event. There will be 3 code words displayed on the screen throughout the presentation. Please make sure you take note of all 3 of those. We are not able to give those out after the presentation concludes. So please make sure you write those down throughout the presentation. I will go ahead and turn it over to Lauren with VonLehman.
Thank you, Katie. And as Katie said, as you guys have questions, please feel free to chat those in, or if you're confident enough to interrupt me and ask them live, I'd be happy to address those throughout the presentation if you're wanting to do that. So today we're going to talk about the risks that come with operating in a remote environment. And it's taking a little, there we go. So today, I know some of you have been to some of our presentations before talking about fraud and internal controls. So we just want to give a quick refresher just so everybody's on the same page of kind of the background of the discussion today. And then we're going to talk about how things to think about as you evaluate your own organization during this remote period, or kind of as you're transitioning back to either a hybrid model or fully back in the office, and just how things might be a little different. And some tips and tricks to look for or to think about within your organization as you move forward with that. And then our friends Amy and Sean at Fraternal Law are going to come forward with some case studies of recent fraud issues that have come up and what could go wrong when that happens. Okay, so as I mentioned, the refresher on fraud. So there's really 3 things that happen for fraud to occur, this perfect storm, I like to call it. So there has to be some sort of financial pressure. So that individual that's going to create or to commit fraud, they have to feel some sort of pressure. So whether that's, it's typically personal, usually financial. So maybe, especially within the 18 months, maybe there's a lot of medical bills that they have, and they're worried of how they're going to be able to pay those, or they've had to go down to a part-time status to be able to take care of a significant other who maybe has been sick, or they themselves got sick and they just feel like they can't make ends meet anymore. So that financial pressure is typically there. And then the second piece is rationalization. So they have to be able to rationalize in their mind that what they're going to do or what they want to do is okay. So maybe they feel underappreciated at the organization. Maybe they see it as just borrowing. They have full intention of paying it back, but this is just a way that they can make ends meet for that short period of time that they need to. And then the third piece of this is an opportunity. So they have the financial pressure, they're able to rationalize it, and they think there's an opportunity for them to commit this fraud. So an example of that would be, everybody's been working remote. Nobody is asking for receipts when they submit their expense reports. So everybody's just kind of operating on a different way than they're typically meant to do. So they're sending in their expense reports with no receipts, and nobody's asking. So there's an opportunity for them to submit some fraudulent receipts and get reimbursed without any questions asked. So those 3 things have to be present for fraud to occur. And really the only piece of it that an organization can really control is the opportunity. And that opportunity, again, is just the solution to their problem. So they have this perceived opportunity. They're able to find this solution that relieves their financial pressure, and they're able to make that rationalization a reality. So as an organization, you can remove that opportunity to reduce the risk of fraud within your organization. And I wish we had a special noise or something, but the first CPE word, if you're tracking these, is controls. Okay, so internal controls are the overlapping policies and procedures that an organization follows when they're carrying out their activities. And these are designed to minimize the risk of fraud, ensure accurate reporting, and then also promote operational efficiency. So there's ways to design your procedures that are most efficient while also minimizing risks and ensuring that there aren't any errors. And then also it encourages your employees to adhere to the rules and policies that you've designed. And within the internal control environment, there's 4 key control activities. And those are listed here as the segregation of duties, authorization and approval, and reconciliation and review, and physical security. So to talk a little bit about each of these, segregation of duties is when the different policies and procedures and individual responsibilities are divided amongst different employees so that the risk of error or inappropriate actions or fraud is reduced. So to give an example, the easiest example that always comes to my mind is when you receive cash at your organization or checks. If one person opens the mail, takes out all the checks, takes those checks to the bank, and then also enters them into your accounting system, that's like the worst possible option of segregation of duties. One person is in charge of everything. So in an ideal situation, you would have one person who opens the checks and makes a list and adds up the total checks that came in that day. And then another person that takes those checks to the bank and comes back with that receipt, the deposit receipt. And that first individual is going to check, okay, here's what I added up. Here's what was just deposited. Those agree. Now we know that all the checks that I opened were now deposited in the bank. And they give that documentation to the bookkeeper, who's going to reconcile that the deposit showing on the bank statement at the end of the month is in agreement with what the person deposited at the bank. So that's an example, a pretty easy example of segregation of duties. There's obviously different limitations depending on the size of your organization, and the smaller the organization, you have to get a little more creative in designing those appropriately, but there are ways to do it regardless of the size. The next key control activity is authorization and approval. So transactions should be authorized and approved just to help ensure that activity is consistent with your departmental goals and objectives, really. So for example, a department, they might have a policy that all purchase orders and invoices must be approved by the director, executive director, before anything is purchased or before anything is paid. So having that second set of eyes on something is one important piece of an internal control. And then the third, reconciliation and review. So this is really focusing on compliance, looking for any unusual trends within the transactions that are occurring, thinking of something as simple as a bank statement that needs to be reconciled on a monthly basis so that you're not missing any errors, or errors aren't going on and on for months without being noticed. So looking at the bank reconciliations on a monthly basis, printing out financial statements, looking at those, comparing them to your budget, that process of reviewing and reconciling is an important piece in designing your internal controls. And then lastly, the physical security. So this covers the equipment that you have at the organization. This covers the check stocks or any credit cards that are maintained in the office. Physical security over those. Do you lock the door to the HR director's office where all of the personnel records are kept? Do you lock the drawer where all of your blank check stock is kept? And who has access to that information? So you wouldn't leave, on vacation and not lock your house. It's the same situation at the office. You have physical security over the equipment, the assets, and things like that. So some of the most common and most important areas to develop sound internal controls within are the cash receipts process, cash disbursements, your financial close. So what happens at the end of the month with reconciling all of your accounts, producing your financial statements, your board review, things of that nature, and then also payroll if you have payroll. So the goal is really just to create a set of checks and balances on the procedures that your staff is performing and documenting those, looking at where the holes are with your internal controls. Okay, so within the last 18 months, we all know, and I feel like I don't need to repeat this, but we all know everything's changed. Your organization is most likely operating a bit differently than it did 18 months ago. So the controls that you had in place 18 months ago, before this world pandemic became a thing, probably aren't as effective in today's day and age, or the operations that you're doing today. So what has changed? How do you communicate and collaborate with your employees? Where and when do your employees work? Are they working remotely? Are they working from the office? Is it a mix? Have you had any big changes in the roles and the organizational structure? Things like turnover in employees or reduction in staff. Maybe you've had a lot of people that are going part-time versus full-time. Just some consolidation of responsibilities and duties that you used to be able to spread out amongst employees. Ways that approval is documented. So before, maybe you were able to walk next door to have the executive director approve an invoice, but now it has to be sent via email, or there's another method that you guys are using to approve invoices. How are all those things changed over the last 18 months? And what does that look like from an internal control perspective? Are there gaps and weaknesses in those internal controls that weren't there before, that are there now and need to be evaluated? So it's really important to perform regular health checks on your control environment and your internal controls, and look at those significant changes that need to be addressed. Okay, so just to get us thinking about different ways that you want to look at your organization, or just, you know, some brainstorming starting points, let's talk about the control environment. And that control environment is that the tone at the top that management and that the board sets for your organization, those ethical standards that your organization is built upon. So within a normal operation, sometimes that can be hard to set and to really promote within your employees. But in a remote environment where you're not all gathering together for meetings, and you might not see each other face to face very often, that can be even more difficult. So, you know, looking ahead from where you are now to where you're going within the next year, how are you going to be able to continue to set that control environment that you want, making sure that individuals understand the processes and procedures, how you conduct business, and those ethical standards that you want your employees to live by. Okay, and then roles and responsibilities. So again, things have changed. People have come and gone, maybe roles are shifting a little bit. So do you have your roles and responsibilities clearly defined, and have they been communicated? Does this employee understand what is expected of him, and does this employee understand how they fit into the piece of the puzzle? So are employees starting to share duties that once was, you know, performed by two different people? When you have, documenting your policies and procedures is not a quick task. It's going to take some time, but when you have everything laid out and you're able to see overall who's in your organization, what are they responsible for, you can kind of map out where those holes are. You can start to see, okay, employee A has 3 different, you know, duties, and they kind of overlap. Maybe we need to separate her duties with somebody else, you know, mix things together so that you're not creating these opportunities for fraud to occur within your organization. So if you haven't already done this, I encourage you to spend the time and get your employees involved in that to document those procedures, those policies, so that you're able to see where your holes and weaknesses are. And then if you already have them documented, when's the last time you've looked at that to say, yeah, that's accurate, or, you know, we need to shift some things around to different people to make sure that there aren't any opportunities there. Okay, and then safeguarding the assets, that physical control. So you might consider who's in the office at what time, and do they have access to what they need to, but not more than what they need to? If there are limited staff in the office and people aren't watching for what's going on, if your payroll person is in the office and somebody walks into their office unannounced to like dig through their file cabinet, that's going to be a huge red flag. But if that HR person isn't in the office and somebody else is and wants access to that, if the door's not locked, it's easy to get in, right? So again, looking at that physical control over your assets and making sure all that's in order. And then another thing that we're going to dive in a little deeper with is access to the software and the databases. Everybody should have access to just what they need. You don't need to provide administrative access to everybody who has a login. Most software can be customized with the access to really carve out that piece of the software that one individual is going to need so that they're not accessing more than they need or have the opportunity, again, to commit fraud within that. Another thing to think about is who's authorized on the bank. It might look different today than it did a year and a half ago. Maybe you need some more people who are able to authorize payments or authorize transfers, but are they the right people? Are you monitoring who does and who doesn't have access to that? The next CPE word is Greek. So if you're wanting CPE today, that word is Greek. Okay, so kind of continuing the conversation on the software, technology is definitely an area that it's not a new thing, that there's a lot of cybersecurity issues going on, but even more so in the last year and a half, we've seen such an uptick in the number of cyber threats that have come across. And so thinking about how your employees are accessing the system remotely, are they using a VPN to access? How are they collaborating and sharing documents and information? I know at our firm, we use a secure portal where we upload documents that we send to our clients through a secure portal that allows them to download them securely. It just alleviates any issues in transferring the files and makes things safe. Excuse me. Again, who has access to that software? Can that role be customized to limit the access? And then thinking about your software in general, is it outdated? Is it still supported by the software manufacturer? I think sometimes in a smaller organization, the budgets just aren't there to come, when new software comes out, they don't just jump on it right away because it's expensive to implement and time consuming too. But taking a look at the software that you're using, seeing if there's anything that's new that could be easily implemented or a low cost to implement. Things like Bill.com, for instance, is a great program that will allow you to approve invoices for payment electronically. It provides the necessary controls so that individuals can get in to approve it, or it's uploaded directly from an email. It makes things a little more secure, a little quicker and easier to upload in a remote environment. Also, there are options for employee expense reports. So you don't have to have your employees take a picture of their receipt and send it via email. You can have them upload it to a software that is much easier to hit the reject button when they don't have a necessary receipt. So things like that can help you design your internal controls to be a little more efficient. So today, IT is really more than just that supporting element. It's fully integrated into everything you do. So looking into those options is a big piece of this. I was just reading an article this morning actually about what are some of the easy, quick, low cost or no cost ways to improve your technology and the security there. And one of them was implementing a multi-factor authentication where possible. And we use that internally here, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with that as well. And it's where you are accessing something online. So I'm logging into our system and it sends me a text message with a code. So in order for somebody to intercept that, it's much more difficult for them to know my password and also have access to my phone at the same time to be able to get in without both of those at their fingertips. So that's an easy thing to implement within your system. Formalizing and communicating those financial approval processes is also something that's really important. If everybody in the organization knows, or at least those involved in the financial piece, who's able to approve an invoice, at what level are they allowed to approve it up to. So if you were to get an email from the executive director with an invoice to pay for $30,000, and you know that the process is he can approve anything up to 5, but over 5, it requires a board approval. If you know that it's a policy, it's communicated to you, you're not just going to automatically send a check to that organization. So having that set up and communicated is most important as well. Regular training for employees. So this is something that is not as common, but is really important. So regardless of your organization, the human nature of how we do business is the biggest threat to your organization, but it's also the biggest preventative measure as well. So when a threat comes in, it's targeted towards a person or towards the human element of somebody making a request via email to transfer funds. And that first line of defense is your employee. So if they have not received any training about what to look for, what kind of phishing attempts are out there, what kind of cyber threats there are, they might just say, yeah, okay, here, I'll download this file and do whatever I need to do because you're asking me and I'm following your orders. So having that constant training, reminders, top of mind type communication to your employees is a big deal as well. I know there are IT consulting firms that will run these programs for you. They might send out some fake cyber threats to your employees via email, and when they open it, it's a learning opportunity. It's not a real threat, but they kind of get to understand how to look for those, what to look for, and how to address it when they find them. And then along with that, it's important you talk about that tone at the top. Part of that is making sure that you're prioritizing the security of your organization over, the speed of how you respond to something. So if you've ever gotten an email like this, it's typically somebody, the president or the executive director, sending an employee an email saying, I'm out of town, I need you to do this right away, it's very urgent. And it gives that sense of ignore all policies and procedures, just do what I'm telling you to do. And so if that's part of your culture to follow those requests, then that employee is not going to think twice before they do it. But if it's not part of your culture and you prioritize that thinking before you act, the security behind it, then that's going to throw up a red flag to your employee. So that tone at the top kind of shines through here as well, making sure that your employees understand that it's not all about the speed at which they respond to your requests, but making sure that they understand that there's security involved as well. And then reconciling your accounts and monitoring your activity regularly, like I had mentioned before, there's really no exceptions to this. You need to develop a good timeline of what you're going to do on a monthly basis or a weekly basis, even quarterly, looking at your budget to actuals to look for any unusual activity. In smaller organizations, we recommend that a treasurer get involved because they can provide that third set of eyes on something or that higher level view. They're not involved in the day-to-day transactions, but they're able to look at the overall performance of the organization and maybe see some of those red flags. If you're working with alumni associations or local chapters, a lot of those are volunteer run. It's small. It's just kind of a different animal than having a corporate office set up. So any ways that you can involve others in reviewing or reconciling their information is going to go a long way with setting up some good controls. Okay, and we have a poll. So I'm interested to see what within your organization, when was the last time that you reviewed the processes and procedures and the internal controls to determine whether they're properly designed to identify gaps and weaknesses? Has that been recently within the last 12 months, or has it been longer than that? Maybe you're not sure, maybe you've never done it. So we're interested to kind of see within this group today where you fall on that. And I think what's most important here is that we don't want to just wait for this situation to happen again. I think this has kind of been a realization that we need to have some good policies and procedures in place when we do have to make a change very quickly. And, you know, I think that was what was so unique about the pandemic that started last year, was that it seemed like at a moment's notice, we were all thrown into a remote environment. So there wasn't time to plan. There wasn't time to document our procedures, or, you know, did you already have a VPN capability in place? If not, you were scrambling to set it up, or you were operating without that in place and opening yourselves up to risk. So I think the most important thing to think about is doing this on a regular basis and not waiting for something like this to happen again. Those controls are, the control environment is always changing. It's moving from, you know, something as simple as a new employee starting or a new role, somebody's leaving, new software that comes in the door, maybe operating your programs a little differently. There's so many things that make that control environment change that it's important to do this assessment on a regular basis. All right.
So Lauren, I just shared, these are the final poll results.
Okay. And everybody can see this, I assume, on their screens.
That is correct.
Okay. So it looks like we have a good group of you within the last 12 months that have done this, which is really great to hear. Some of you not sure. So kind of a split between the two of those. So very good. Okay. And so this doesn't fall on the weight of one person within your firm. There's really, this is a team approach. So board members have a role, management has a role. Board members should be able to understand those fraud risks, or should be brainstorming, how does fraud occur within this organization? That's something that we would like to see them do annually, just to brainstorm different ways in which fraud could occur. And then periodically, they should be assessing those risks that the organization is open to. And then they're also responsible for overseeing the internal controls established by management. So asking management, what are your internal controls? What have you implemented to address these risks? And then they also have a big role in setting the tone at the top as well. Management, again, involved in setting the tone at the top. They are responsible for implementing those internal controls, designing and implementing them, documenting the policies and procedures, and then reporting to the board what actions they are taking to minimize those fraud risks. And then your employees also have a big role in this. And like I said, the employees are the first line of defense in any of those cyber attacks. And so they have a very important role. They need to be aware of what fraud is and be aware of those red flags that might indicate fraud. It would be beneficial for them to attend some periodic trainings about fraud, either that management does, or maybe you have an outside party come in to teach them about fraud. Understanding their role within that internal control framework. So how are they responsible for maintaining the internal control? Do they understand that this process that they do is meant to keep, to minimize a risk over here? And then they need to be responsible for reading and understanding the policies and procedures that are established by the organization. And then they also need to be responsible for reporting any suspicions or incidences of fraud that they know of to the appropriate people. And a lot of times we see success in the ability to do this anonymously. So a lot of times an employee might feel like they're going to lose their job if they report fraud, or there's that fear of not wanting to be pointed out, or the bad guy. So having an anonymous way for them to report fraud is a great tool in the organization, and most fraud is tipped off by an anonymous employee within the organization. So that's typically how those are uncovered. Okay, any questions so far about this piece of it, or any additional ideas or thoughts that you guys might have about kind of your situation in particular, or just other remote weaknesses that you might be experiencing? Okay, your next code word is risks. And now Sean and Amy are going to talk about a couple case studies with some fraud.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren, and thank you all for being here. As Lauren said, I'm Amy Hebbeler. I'm an associate with Fraternal Law Partners, and I'm joined today here by Sean Callan, who's a partner at Fraternal Law Partners as well. So Lauren did a great job of providing the framework and resources to prevent fraud through internal controls. And we just want to give a couple of examples of what we've seen and how we've seen this play out in the real world. And kind of what kind of trouble people have gotten into when they haven't implemented those controls that Lauren's laid out. So that we're going to look at 3 different case studies. The first one will be where there were no internal controls. The second one being where they did have some internal controls, but those failed. And then the third one is kind of a different type of way that we've seen this come about. And that is where there's been some type of fraud, not necessarily in order to gain have direct monetary gain, but in more of an indirect way. So the first case that Sean will kick us off with is that one where there were no internal controls.
Yeah. Thanks, Amy. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be here. Glad to see a lot of familiar names out there in the attendee list. As Amy said, this case really involves something where the controls were basically absent. And this is a situation that, quite frankly, across sort of the Greek community, happens with some regularity, and it happens really with our smaller organizations, like our house corporations, or in this case, an alumni association. And it happens for a variety of reasons, but really it's those smaller groups, those smaller organizations where there's the most risk, I would say. And if you Google sort of embezzlement or fraud, fraternity, sorority, you'll get a lot of hits. So this is something that is definitely occurring in our market. It seems to be, I don't know if it's occurring more regularly or we're just finding out about it more. It could be either one, but it's something that we really need to pay attention to. And we'll talk about this a little more too. It's obviously difficult because we work on volunteers. We don't have staff to staff these kinds of organizations. And so finding ways to implement these kinds of controls that Lauren talked about can be difficult. I'm glad to hear that she said she understands there can be struggles in designing these controls, but there are ways to do it. That's good to hear because I think we need to come up with some answers here. Case number 1 involved, as I said before, an alumni association. The woman who perpetrated the fraud was the treasurer of that organization, and she had been the treasurer of the organization for a very, very long time, more than a decade. And just as we sort of think about fraud generally, when we think about people who have occupied the same seat for a long time, that lends itself to the possibility of fraud because they've been there for a long time. They know how the system works. And in this case, they really didn't have any oversight and no one understood the system like she did. And so that, sort of on its face would sort of, if you're thinking about it, might make one wonder what really is going on with this group's finances. Well, in this case, this woman had figured out how to actually use association checks to pay directly for personal credit cards. So she would just write checks because she had check writing authority over the accounts of the organization. She also had the ability to just directly withdraw cash money from the organization, which she would also do. And she was also able to, in various ways, deposit funds directly into her own bank accounts and accounts that she controlled. So, when we think about controls, there we had one person basically who was in charge of expenditures for this organization, which, that in reality, that could be easily fixed if we had, 2 signature requirements or something like that. But that was the control that was sort of missing there. And then on the backside, because she was the treasurer, she was also in charge of the books and records of the company. All right. So when it came time to account for all of this money, both in and out, she was the person doing that. So, obviously what she would do is make false entries and omissions in the association's financial records to cover up what she was doing. And she was able to do that fairly easily because, again, she had authority to spend money and write checks, and was also in charge of the books on the other side. So that was a problematic situation, although because of her position and her long-term tenure, this went on for 14, 15, I forget, 15 or 16 years, something like that. Over that period of time, it was kind of hard to pin down, but it looks like the total loss is somewhere around $1.6 million, which is, $110,000 a year. So that's a tremendous loss for an alumni association. And so when we look back in retrospect to see how this could have happened, I mean, the failures we saw is that there was no oversight over this position really in any meaningful way. This provided the increased opportunity for fraud, which Warren talked about. And most importantly, there was insufficient separation or segregation of duties. This woman had a pretty free reign over all aspects of the financial operations of the company, and that's a problem. And so, the controls that would be easiest here would be, to segregate those authorities, and probably have dual signatures on expenditures, so at least we get some oversight on the initial spend of money. And I saw Lauren pop out on the video. I don't know, did you have something to add, or are you just coming back to say hi? Okay. All right. So that was sort of the first one that we found interesting. It's interesting because, the long-term tenure of the employee, which resulted in really no controls that are apparent, and combined with the size of the loss. I mean, that's a huge loss. So that's why we found it interesting and decided to present it here today. Amy, I think you got the next one, right?
I do. So our second case is where there were some internal controls. And I think importantly Lauren talked about a lot of different controls. And I think sometimes we find that organizations will maybe pick one thing and implement that one control. But that doesn't mean that you're in the clear. So it's important to keep all of those internal controls in mind. Can you implement everything? I don't know. That's more of a practical thing, but you should definitely implement more than one of those things. Because we saw here, there was the organization contracted with a company to provide financial management resources to manage the house corporation's finances. So this is a step in the right direction. We have some controls in place. This is not the same situation that Sean just talked about, where we have everything housed in one person. But it's important to keep in mind when organizations contract out certain services, the directors still have those fiduciary duties. You cannot put those duties on someone else. You still have those fiduciary duties, duty of care, make sure you're hiring competent people, make sure the contract is what you think it is, make sure they're doing what you think it is. So here they've taken that initial step of we're going to hire an outside organization, a third party, to manage our finances. Then the house corporation constructed a chapter house. And the president of the chapter house was responsible for coordinating and purchasing all of the furniture that was going to go into that new house. So because what the president said was the management company process invoices slow. So instead of submitting invoices and getting money for that to them pay the invoices, or instead of submitting any other type of substantiation, she would request amounts without providing anything to support those expenses. And so what she did is she submitted those expenses. The financial management services released the amounts to her, released the funds to her. She would pay for some of the furniture that she got, but she also requested funds in excess of what those pieces of furniture actually costed. And she actually kept the excess herself. She kept it in her closet. And I think up to eventually what it came out to was around $235,000 in excess funds that she had in her closet at home. When they asked her, she had a bunch of different reasons for it. I was doing this because for efficiency. I was doing this because I was going to give a scholarship, I think. I'm using that money to get a scholarship. But again, this individual is keeping this amount in her own personal closet in her house. So on top of that, in addition to those excess funds, she actually created false invoices that appeared to be from one of their suppliers, though it was a slightly misspelled name of the supplier, and with fake documentation, opened up a bank account, deposited the checks that she got from the financial management services for those invoices, and had her actually listed in that fake documentation as the CFO of this supplier company. Later, she transferred those funds from that fake bank account to her own personal funds. And I think she said later she actually paid for furniture. Again, what her justification was in that is that this company processes invoices too slow. So she wanted to have this fund readily available for her to purchase furniture. And I think the invoices that she submitted that were fake, again, when she submitted those invoices, there was nothing that she was actually going to pay for it. She submitted those invoices. She got the cash for some future furniture purchases. And that was $375,000. So here we have two different things going on. We have the first one is that there's no substantiation happening with this financial management company. So instead of managing the finances, this company has really started functioning as a bank. They weren't requesting substantiation. She wasn't providing it. And so that's why she was able to request amounts above what those actual expenses were so that she could pocket that money. And then on the other side, there were these fake invoices that were being issued and being paid for. Something to keep in mind is that this is not like a slap on the wrist type of action. These are serious federal charges. For example, in this case, the president was indicted on wire fraud, bank fraud, money laundering. So there are these very serious federal charges. It's not just pay back the money. And I think she ended up did pay back most of the money, and she pled guilty to bank fraud. So kind of the lesson that we learned here, the fail is that there's no substantiation. Lauren discussed earlier about, we have authorization and approval. Was anyone authorizing these invoices? Was anyone authorizing these requests that she was making from the financial management company? What about the reconciliation and review? Was anyone after asking for that substantiation? If it wasn't readily available, were they asking for a follow-up in order to match those accounts? They were not. So those are the things to keep in mind here. Definitely require that substantiation. If you have established controls, make sure that you're following them. Like Lauren said, it's a kind of a slow process to get those controls in place. But if you have those controls in place and you're not following them, then you're going to run into these types of issues as well. And then the third lesson here is that just because you have a third party that is helping and assisting with these services, the board and the directors still have those financial duties to steward the funds and to act with their duty of care in the best interests of the organization. And this too, in kind of context, is it's not just that this person's getting indicted, it also brings the organization, it's your reputation, it's how you're going to tell donors that you're stewarding your funds properly if something like this happens. So that's why there's this increased importance to have those internal controls that Lauren discussed in place. So I'll turn it over to Sean for the less conventional case study that we wanted to bring up.
Yeah, and Amy, you make a good point. Just sort of flashing back to the first slide, but which you don't have to do, by the way. I'm flashing everyone back mentally. The perpetrator in that case, was indicted for multiple counts of bank fraud and wire fraud. Ended up pleading out to one count of wire fraud. Went to jail or federal prison for 27 months. Had an extended period of probation after that, and this was very interesting. She was hit with a $1.6 million restitution order. So she'll be paying this off for the rest of her life, obviously. But I'm sure that the group will never be made whole. But it's the consequences to someone who goes down this path are severe. I mean, these are not sort of mess around crimes. The third one, this is a little different. It's also outside of the Greek world, but this involved a public charity that was really a grant-making foundation. Didn't have any operations of its own to speak of, so it's reminiscent anyway of some of our foundations and what they do. But I thought that the fact pattern was significantly interesting that we could talk about it here. So this was a small organization, didn't have a lot of money, had a volunteer board, obviously, but they were able to hire an executive director, and the executive director had basically been there, I think, since this charity began, or maybe she was a second one. I'm not quite sure about that, but she'd been there a long time. And over the years, the charity had gathered some assets, both in its general operating funds, and also had a large number of restricted funds that were geared towards certain grants that the donors wanted this charity to undertake. After a period of time, the executive director and the foundation itself kind of ran into problems fundraising for operations, which happens to many groups. So you got to sort of figure out how to make ends meet. What this particular director did was decided to use some of the restricted funds to cover some operating expenses, and sort of pull through a bad fundraising period in that way. So it did a couple things. First, and I think what it says here is it appears to make the annual fundraise look better. It does that, but it also makes the executive director also look like a good manager of the operation overall. This particular sort of transaction would be very, very difficult, in my view, for the board to see just by looking at 990s, because this went on for some period of time, and no one really picked up on it, and I'm not sure looking back on it that you could, just because of the way 990s are prepared and what information they actually show. I think to actually see this, what you would have to do is go back and look into the statements for each of those endowed accounts or restricted accounts, and see how the withdrawals and the deposits, and of course the income, because all these accounts were earning income, how all that sort of worked out. But when you are just presented with sort of a summary balance sheet and income statement like on a 990, I don't think you're going to see this kind of a maneuver. So it's a little different because it's not exactly fraud in the sense that this executive director stole money. She didn't. What she really did is sort of misuse restricted funds for purposes for which they were not meant. And it's difficult as a board member because this is your highest level employee, and even if you're doing your job and reviewing the 990s before they're filed, you're not going to see this. So what do you do? And I just threw out this idea. I don't know if this is common in the industry, frankly. Until this happened, I never really thought about this because I've never known an executive director really to do that. But it may be important, for our foundations or for our entities that hold these kinds of restricted funds, that maybe you need controls like with the bank or somewhere else that says that if you are intending to move funds out of these accounts, then you need some enhanced level of authorization, whether it's just a double signature on those or something along those lines to just sort of put an added layer of protection around movement of funds out of a restricted account. I know that, as a lawyer, we have, here we call it an IOLTA account. So it's a trust account that holds clients' money, not law firm money and not personal money. It's only client money. And to get money out of there, we do have to go through an enhanced withdrawal process with the bank. So, I guess theoretically, yes, we could take client money out of that account, but we would have to commit fraud to do it. It's not something that somebody could just do on their own. We have requirements in place. So, I thought it was an interesting fact pattern. I don't know that I've ever seen anything quite like it before. But there's certainly a failure of controls here in that one employee was able to use restricted funds for operational purposes. Amy, anything to add? Oh, there you are. Okay.
No, I think that was great. And that's kind of, we wanted to present that these can manifest, this kind of fraud and getting around these internal controls can manifest in different ways. And that's just one of them, but people are very creative. And that's something to keep in mind in both good and bad ways. So just presenting this as a different thing that to keep on your radar and just pay attention to. But now that we talked about the 3 case studies, there's also something that we wanted to bring up in terms of why else. I mean, we need to care because one, like we talked about, the reputation of your organizations, your donors. Again, you don't want people to do this, to get in trouble, to kind of siphon funds from the organization, but also for insurance purposes. Is fraud or embezzlement covered in your insurance? So we've seen recently, and insurance companies are taking notice of this, and this is what Sean mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, is that there is this increased frequency at which fraud and embezzlement is either happening or we're realizing it, and kind of specifically in the fraternal world. And what that is doing is it's increasing insurance deductibles to include that coverage, or alternatively, that coverage isn't even offered because insurance companies are saying this over and over again, and it's not something that they're going to want to cover with the frequency that it's occurring. So on top of everything else that we've discussed today, that Lawrence discussed, that Sean's discussed, it's important from an insurance perspective for organizations to get these controls in place and reduce those risks to decrease those occurrences that we've seen, and hopefully kind of prevent those insurance rates from continuing to rise because of the frequency that we've seen this either happening or that we're now more aware of it. So if you take anything else from this, kind of the lessons learned from the 3 case studies that we've discussed, and Lauren, you can go to the next slide, and this is just from the first one, what Sean talked about, is that separate approval, or do you have someone writing checks? Do you have someone approving it? Or is there someone else bookkeeping? That second case study, are you requiring substantiation? If that substantiation isn't available before those funds are provided, are you then following up and requiring it afterwards? Are you following those established controls? And then that third one that Sean discussed was segregating those duties with those internal transfers. Are you kind of paying attention to that in the different ways that this can arise? So Sean, do you have anything else to add for our lessons?
No, I mean, that's the gist of it. I mean, the segregation issue is huge. And here's our conference. Amy, take it away.
So we are very, very excited for our 2021 Fraternal Law Conference. It is November 4th and 5th, and we're especially excited because it will be both in person and virtual. So we're excited to be able to get back together with everyone. I think it's been a very long year of not being able to see some of our favorite people. And so we encourage you all to come and to sign up. The registration is in the link at fraternallaw.com, and it will be at Great American Ballpark again. So please come out, and we look forward to seeing you all there.
One clarification: we are asking if you plan to attend in person, that you be vaccinated. So, and if you're not going to get vaccinated, then we have a virtual option as well.
So either virtual or in person, we look forward to connecting with you all. Katie?
Thank you all so much. Amy, Sean, Lauren, thank you for your insights, your time preparing for the event. Fraternal Law, we always appreciate partnering with you. As a reminder, we will be sending out the presentation as well as a link to the recording. Also, the link will be there for your CPE certification. I apologize. So please make sure you have those 3 codes available. Complete that certification if you need it. And with that, that concludes our event. Thank you so much for your time, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you all.